It was a typical Tuesday morning on the crowded downtown bus in Chicago. The summer heat was already building, making the packed bus feel even more claustrophobic as commuters shuffled their way through another rush hour. Among them sat a 15-year-old boy in his blue school uniform, earbuds in, quietly bobbing his head to music while scrolling through his phone. The bus lurched to a stop at Lincoln Avenue, and through the doors came an elderly woman, probably in her mid-70s, clutching her worn leather purse and struggling to maintain her balance as the bus started moving again. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and despite the heat, she wore a carefully pressed floral dress that spoke of a different era. Without hesitation, the young man stood up, removed his earbuds, and gestured to his seat. "Please, ma'am, you can sit here," he said with a gentle smile. The woman's tired eyes lit up with gratitude as she accepted his offer, settling into the now vacant seat with visible relief. The boy grabbed onto the overhead rail, continuing his journey standing up, thinking nothing more of this small act of kindness. After all, it was exactly what his mother had taught him since he was little, to always show respect to his elders and help others whenever possible. 3 stops later, the elderly woman started gathering her belongings. As she rose from her seat, she pulled something from her purse, a small piece of paper. With slightly trembling hands, she pressed it into the boy's palm, patting his hand softly before making her way to the exit. Before he could say anything, she was gone, disappearing into the stream of pedestrians outside. The boy stared at the folded note in his hand, curious about what this stranger could have written. As he unfolded it, his eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat. The words on that paper would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but touch the hearts of an entire community. What he didn't know then was that the elderly woman wasn't just any passenger. She was someone who had spent decades watching society change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And in that simple act of kindness from a young stranger, she saw something that moved her to take an extraordinary step. The other passengers continued their morning commute, unaware that they had just witnessed the beginning of a remarkable story. Some were buried in their phones, others stared out windows, and a few dozed off, none realizing that right there, in their midst, a moment of genuine human connection had just sparked something incredible. The boy's fingers trembled slightly as he read the first few lines of the note. The carefully written words spoke of a life filled with experiences he couldn't have imagined, and a request that would soon test his character in ways he never expected. But more than that, they revealed a truth about human connections that would touch thousands of hearts once his story spread. Standing there, swaying with the motion of the bus, holding a note from a stranger who had already vanished into the city, the young man felt his heart racing. Should he follow through with what the note asked of him? Could he? And more importantly, what would happen if he did? Little did he know that this simple bus ride, this small gesture of giving up his seat, and this mysterious note would soon become a story that would inspire people across the country. But first, he had to make a choice, one that would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. As he folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, the weight of its message felt heavier than the paper it was written on. The next 3 minutes would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone who would eventually hear his story. The boy pulled the note from his pocket again as he walked up the steps to his high school, his mind still racing from what he'd read. The elegant handwriting told a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. The elderly woman, as it turned out, was Mrs. Thompson, a retired school principal who had spent over 4 decades in education. "My dear young man," the note began, "your simple act of kindness this morning brought tears to my eyes. In a world where many have forgotten the importance of respect and compassion, you gave me hope. But there's something you should know." Mrs. Thompson explained that she had been conducting a social experiment for the past month, riding different bus routes across the city. She was documenting how people treated the elderly, hoping to write an article about society's changing values. Day after day, she had stood on crowded buses, watching as dozens of young people stared at their phones, pretending not to notice her or others who needed seats. But this morning had been different. This morning, she had met him. What he didn't realize was that she wasn't just any retired principal. She was the founder of one of the city's most prestigious scholarship programs. For years, she had been searching for students who demonstrated genuine character, not just academic excellence. The boy's hands trembled as he read the next part again. I want to offer you a full scholarship to any college of your choice. But there was a catch. Mrs. Thompson wanted him to prove that his kindness wasn't a one-time thing. She had set up a challenge, a series of seemingly random acts of kindness that he would need to complete over the next month, without anyone knowing about the scholarship opportunity. At the bottom of the note was a phone number and instructions to text a specific code word if he accepted the challenge. As he stood there in the school hallway, the morning bell rang, snapping him back to reality. His best friend Alex appeared beside him, noticing his distracted expression. Hey, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost, Alex said, trying to peek at the note. The boy quickly folded it and tucked it away. How could he explain what had just happened? More importantly, should he accept this strange challenge? Throughout his classes that day, he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Thompson's words. The scholarship would be life-changing. His single mom had been working 2 jobs to save for his college education, and even then, they both knew it wouldn't be enough for a top university. But something about the challenge made him uncomfortable. Wasn't kindness supposed to be genuine, not performed for a reward? Would accepting this offer somehow make his good deeds less meaningful? And what exactly would these random acts of kindness entail? During lunch break, he sat alone in the school courtyard, watching his classmates go about their day. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. A freshman struggling with too many books, a student eating lunch by themselves, a teacher juggling a stack of papers while trying to open a door. Were these the kinds of situations Mrs. Thompson wanted him to look out for? His phone felt heavy in his pocket, the decision weighing on him. The rational part of his brain told him this was too good to be true. Things like this didn't just happen in real life. But another part of him remembered the sincere look in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, the gentle way she had pressed the note into his hand. After school, he took the same bus route home, hoping to see her again, to ask questions, to make sure this wasn't some elaborate prank. But she wasn't there. Instead, he found himself watching the other passengers more carefully than usual, noticing small moments where someone might need help, where a simple gesture could make a difference. His phone buzzed, a text from his mom asking if he could pick up some groceries on the way home. As he read her message, his thoughts drifted to all the sacrifices she'd made for him, all the extra shifts she'd taken to give him a better future. The scholarship could change everything for them. But Mrs. Thompson's challenge wasn't just about the money. It was about proving that genuine kindness still existed in a world that often seemed too busy to care. It was about showing that small actions could create ripples of change, touching lives in ways we might never know. As the bus approached his stop, he pulled out his phone again and opened a new message. His thumb hovered over the keypad as he considered the code word from the note. Whatever he decided would set in motion events that would test not just his character, but his understanding of what it truly means to help others. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long shadows through the bus windows. In just a few hours, a simple bus ride had transformed into something much bigger, a choice between taking an extraordinary opportunity and staying true to his principles. Little did he know, Mrs. Thompson's challenge would soon reveal itself to be far more complex than he could have imagined. After 3 weeks of accepting Mrs. Thompson's challenge, the boy found himself transformed in ways he never expected. Each morning, he would wake up to a new text message with a simple task. Not grand gestures, but small acts that required genuine attention to the world around him. Some tasks were straightforward, helping the elderly cross busy intersections, tutoring younger students struggling with math, or organizing a small food drive for the local shelter. Others pushed him far outside his comfort zone, like standing up for a new student being bullied, even though it meant risking his own social standing. What started as a secret challenge had slowly become a way of life. His mother noticed the change in him, commenting one evening how he seemed more thoughtful, more aware. "You remind me of your father," she said softly while they washed dishes together. He always believed that kindness was a strength, not a weakness. The mention of his father, who had passed away 5 years ago, made his heart ache with both pride and sadness. But as the final week of the challenge approached, something unexpected happened. A local news crew showed up at his school to cover a story about declining values among teenagers. They had secretly filmed various scenarios around the city, capturing how young people typically behaved in public spaces. To his shock, he recognized some of the footage, including him helping people over the past few weeks. The reporter wanted to interview him, to understand what motivated his actions. His stomach churned as he politely declined, remembering Mrs. Thompson's strict instruction: complete the tasks without seeking recognition. But the news crew's presence had already sparked curiosity among his classmates. Whispers followed him through the hallways. Some admired his actions, while others questioned his motives. Alex, his best friend, finally confronted him after school. "Why didn't you tell me about any of this? I thought we shared everything." The hurt in Alex's voice made him realize how distant he'd become, so focused on completing the challenge that he'd neglected his friendships. That evening, as he sat on his bed staring at his phone, a new message arrived. But this one was different. "Tomorrow is your final task," it read. "Meet me at the Central Plaza at 4 p.m. Come alone." His heart raced as he realized he would finally see Mrs. Thompson again. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Each class felt like an eternity as his mind wandered to what the final task might be. Would it be something simple, or would Mrs. Thompson push him to his limits one last time? More importantly, had he proven himself worthy of the scholarship? When the final bell rang, he rushed to the bus stop. The same route where everything had begun now felt charged with anticipation. As the bus approached the Central Plaza, he noticed something unusual. A small crowd had gathered, and there were news vans parked nearby. His phone buzzed one last time. "Your final task awaits. But remember, true kindness isn't about recognition or rewards. It's about the choices we make when we think no one is watching." Stepping off the bus, he felt the weight of every choice he'd made over the past month. The crowd seemed to part as he walked toward the center of the plaza, his heart pounding with each step. There, standing near the fountain, was Mrs. Thompson, looking exactly as she had that first morning on the bus. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood several familiar faces, people he'd helped over the past few weeks, each holding something in their hands. And in the front row, tears streaming down her face, was his mother. How did she know to be here? Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her eyes twinkling with the same kindness he remembered. "Before I reveal your final task," she began, her voice carrying across the now silent plaza, "there's something you need to know about these past few weeks." The boy's mind raced as he looked at the gathered crowd. Something bigger was happening here, something beyond a simple scholarship challenge. The realization slowly dawned on him. This final moment would test more than just his kindness. It would test everything he thought he understood about helping others. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried across the plaza as she revealed the truth that would shake everything the boy thought he knew. The scholarship, she began, her eyes meeting his, was never real. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and the boy felt his heart sink to his stomach. Had this all been for nothing? But before he could process this revelation, Mrs. Thompson continued, "Because what awaited you was something far more significant." She gestured to the people gathered around them. The elderly man he'd helped with groceries, the middle school student he'd tutored, the homeless veteran he'd assisted at the shelter, and dozens more faces he recognized from his month of good deeds. Each person here, Mrs. Thompson explained, was given a special task of their own. After receiving your help, they were asked to pay that kindness forward to 3 other people, and those people were asked to do the same. She paused, letting the magnitude of what she was saying sink in. Your single act of kindness on that bus has now touched over 1,000 lives in our city. The boy's mother stepped forward, wiping tears from her eyes. "I knew about this from the beginning," she admitted. "Mrs. Thompson came to me that very first day. But what you don't know is that your father did the exact same thing 25 years ago." Time seemed to stop as he processed these words. His father, whom he'd lost 5 years ago, had been part of the same challenge. Mrs. Thompson nodded, seeing the question in his eyes. "Your father was one of my students," she explained. "He showed the same instinctive kindness you did. And just like you, he never knew he was part of something bigger. But before he could fully grasp this connection to his father, Mrs. Thompson raised her hand, silencing the murmuring crowd. However, she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "We're not finished yet. Your real final task still awaits, and it might be the most challenging one of all." She reached into her purse and pulled out a familiar-looking piece of paper, similar to the note she'd handed him that day on the bus. But this time, as she held it out, her hand trembled slightly. Inside this envelope is a truth that will test everything you've learned about kindness and forgiveness. Before you open it, you need to know that your decision in the next few minutes will affect not just you, but everyone here. The boy looked around at the faces in the crowd, some eager, some anxious, all waiting to see what he would do. The news cameras were rolling, capturing every moment, but they no longer seemed important. His mother's eyes met his, filled with both pride and concern. As he reached for the envelope, Mrs. Thompson held onto it for just a moment longer. "Remember," she said softly, "true character isn't built by the challenges we face, but by the choices we make when those challenges seem impossible." The plaza fell silent as he opened the envelope with trembling fingers. As his eyes scanned the contents, his face went pale. The paper nearly slipped from his grasp as he looked up at Mrs. Thompson in disbelief. "How is this possible?" he whispered. The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, confirming the unbelievable words he had just read. The crowd leaned forward, tension building as they waited to understand what could have caused such a reaction. But the boy's world had narrowed to just the paper in his hands and the weight of the choice he now faced. A choice that would reveal whether a month of practicing kindness had truly changed who he was at his core. The note trembled in the boy's hands as he read the impossible truth. Mrs. Thompson was the driver in the accident that had taken his father's life 5 years ago. She had been searching for him ever since, carrying the weight of that tragic night, wanting to make amends but never finding the courage. Until she saw him on that bus, showing the same kindness his father once had. The crowd fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. The boy's mother stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I've known since last week," she whispered. "Mrs. Thompson finally told me everything. That's why I'm here, to support whatever decision you make." The boy's mind raced back to all those nights his mother had worked double shifts, all the times they'd struggled without his father. The anger he carried, not just about losing his dad, but about the unknown driver who'd never come forward, threatened to overwhelm him. Yet here was that same driver who had spent the past month teaching him about the power of compassion. Mrs. Thompson stood before him, no longer the confident retired principal, but a woman broken by guilt and remorse. "I was a coward," she admitted, her voice cracking. "The shame of what I'd done made me hide. But watching you these past weeks, seeing your father's spirit in every kind act you performed, I knew I had to face the truth. Whatever you decide to do now, I'll accept it." The news cameras rolled silently, capturing what had become much more than a story about random acts of kindness. The boy looked around at the faces in the crowd, all those people whose lives he'd touched, who had then touched others. A chain reaction of goodwill, all stemming from that first simple act on the bus. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The next words he spoke would determine not just his own path, but would impact everyone present. 5 years ago, he began, his voice shaking, "I lost my father, and for 5 years I've held on to anger at the person responsible." He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Thompson. "But these past weeks have taught me something my father always said. Kindness isn't just about helping others. It's about healing ourselves." Then, in front of everyone, he did something that caused his mother to gasp and Mrs. Thompson to break down in tears. He hugged her. "I forgive you," he whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. "And I think my dad would have too." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished with her revelations. Through her tears, she pulled out another envelope. "Your father left this with me 25 years ago after his own kindness challenge. He asked me to give it to his child if they ever showed the same heart he had." She handed him the worn envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter, written in his father's handwriting and a small key. The letter read, "To my future child, if you're reading this, you've learned the most valuable lesson I know, that kindness can change the world. The key opens a safety deposit box at Central Bank. Inside is my gift to you, but the real treasure is the person you've become." The following day at the bank, accompanied by his mother and Mrs. Thompson, he opened the box. Inside wasn't money or valuables, but a journal filled with his father's random acts of kindness, each one documented with photos and notes. On the last page was a single sentence: "The greatest legacy we can leave is the kindness we share with others." But what happened next surprised everyone. The boy took out his phone and pulled up a familiar number, the one he'd been texting all month. "I think it's time," he said, "to start the next challenge." He looked at Mrs. Thompson, who smiled through her tears. "Would you help me find someone else who needs to learn about kindness?" And so, as one story ended, another began. The boy who gave up his seat on a bus had not only changed countless lives, but had also healed wounds he didn't know could be healed. His father's legacy lived on, not in the possessions he left behind, but in the ripples of kindness that would continue to spread through their city, one simple act at a time. As they left the bank that day, his mother squeezed his hand and whispered, "Your father would be so proud." And somewhere, in the busy streets of their city, another person was about to receive an unexpected note that would change everything. 6 months after that transformative day at the bank, the city had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. The local news station, which had captured the moment of forgiveness in the plaza, produced a documentary that went viral, inspiring similar kindness challenges in communities across the country. But for the boy and his family, the real changes were much more personal. Mrs. Thompson became a regular visitor at their home, often joining them for Sunday dinners. The guilt she had carried for years gradually lifted as she found forgiveness not just from the boy and his mother, but from herself. She retired from running her social experiments and instead focused on mentoring young people, teaching them the same lessons about kindness that had brought healing to their lives. The boy's mother finally felt able to reduce her work hours, thanks to a college fund that the community had secretly established. Former recipients of her son's kindness had come together, each contributing what they could, proving that generosity has a way of coming full circle. The safety deposit box with his father's journal became a source of endless inspiration. The boy spent hours reading through the entries, discovering pieces of his father he had never known. Each act of kindness documented in those pages showed him that his father's spirit had never really left. It had just been waiting to be discovered in a different way. As for the boy himself, he continued riding the same bus route where everything began, but now he noticed how other passengers would occasionally give up their seats, help with heavy bags, or simply share a kind word. Small acts that might have gone unnoticed before now seemed to carry extra weight, knowing how far their impact could reach. His best friend Alex not only forgave him for keeping the challenge a secret, but became his partner in organizing monthly kindness projects at their school. What started as two teenagers trying to make a difference grew into a student movement, proving that compassion can be contagious when given the chance to spread. 1 year to the day after receiving that first note on the bus, the boy stood again in the Central Plaza. This time, he wasn't alone. Hundreds of people gathered to launch what would become an annual tradition in their city, the Day of Unexpected Kindness. As he watched families, friends, and strangers exchange small acts of generosity, he couldn't help but smile at how something so simple had grown into something so profound. That evening, as he helped Mrs. Thompson hand out notes to a new group of participants, she paused and touched his arm gently. "You know," she said, "your father once told me that kindness isn't just about making the world better. It's about discovering who we truly are." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with familiar warmth. "I think he would be amazed to see how his legacy lives on through you." As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the plaza where everything had come full circle, the boy realized that the greatest gift wasn't the forgiveness he had given or the kindness he had shared. It was understanding that every small act of compassion carries within it the power to transform lives in ways we might never expect. And somewhere in that city, right at that moment, another person was receiving an unexpected note, about to embark on their own journey of discovery. Because that's the thing about kindness, it never truly ends. It just keeps finding new ways to touch hearts, heal wounds, and remind us all that sometimes the smallest gestures can lead to the biggest changes. After all, you never know when giving up your seat on a bus might just change everything.